One of the more sobering facts of the MCU is that heroism rarely restores what existed before a catastrophe, because even successful interventions leave behind altered lives, relationships, and identities, reinforcing the idea that saving the world often means accepting that the world will never return to its previous form. The MCU quietly suggests that many heroes struggle with the absence of conflict because peace removes the structure that once defined their purpose, creating a sense of aimlessness that can be as destabilizing as constant danger, and revealing how deeply identity can become tied to crisis. A subtle but meaningful truth is that the MCU treats moral compromise as cumulative, showing that small concessions made under pressure gradually reshape characters' values, implying that ethical erosion happens incrementally rather than through a single defining choice. The universe repeatedly implies that forgiveness is more complex than reconciliation, as characters may continue working together while emotional wounds remain unhealed, suggesting that cooperation does not require closure, but often depends on restraint and mutual endurance. One quietly tragic aspect of the MCU is that many heroic acts are performed without witnesses, meaning that some of the most meaningful sacrifices go unrecognized, reinforcing the idea that heroism in this universe is frequently anonymous and unrewarded. The MCU also establishes that fear is not eliminated by experience, because seasoned heroes continue to doubt themselves despite past victories, suggesting that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act alongside it. Another overlooked fact is that the MCU's cities function almost as characters themselves, absorbing damage, adapting, and influencing the behavior of those who live within them, making environments active participants in the narrative rather than passive backdrops. The universe subtly frames hope as contagious, spreading through small personal actions rather than grand gestures, implying that large-scale salvation is sustained by countless individual choices that rarely receive attention or praise. A recurring truth is that many MCU characters are shaped more by what they fail to protect than by what they successfully save, turning loss into a defining element of identity that guides future decisions and priorities. Finally, the MCU consistently portrays legacy as something inherited unwillingly, showing that the impact of heroic actions extends beyond intention, binding future generations to choices they did not make but must nonetheless live with. One of the most human conclusions the MCU reaches is that many heroes never truly feel finished with their past, even when their stories appear complete, because memory continues to shape identity long after action ends, turning endings into pauses rather than resolutions. The MCU quietly suggests that meaning is often assigned retroactively, as characters only understand the significance of their sacrifices after they are made, implying that purpose is discovered through reflection rather than foresight. A subtle but painful truth is that several heroes accept diminished futures in exchange for protecting others, choosing lives that are smaller, quieter, or lonelier than they once imagined, not out of bitterness, but out of responsibility. The universe implies that heroism can narrow a person's world as much as it expands it, limiting personal possibility even while safeguarding collective survival, a trade-off rarely celebrated but consistently portrayed. Another deeply human detail is that characters often say goodbye without knowing it, treating ordinary moments as routine only for their significance to become clear later, reinforcing the fragility of time and connection. The MCU repeatedly shows that letting go is harder than holding on, as characters struggle more with absence than with conflict, suggesting that peace requires a different kind of courage than battle. A quietly hopeful fact is that the MCU allows some characters to step away without proving they deserve rest, framing departure not as failure or reward, but as a necessary act of self preservation. The films and series imply that the world continues imperfectly after heroes act, resisting the fantasy of permanent salvation and instead presenting continuity as messy, uneven, and unresolved. One final human truth is that legacy in the MCU is shaped by compassion as much as by power, with small acts of understanding often resonating longer than victories achieved through force. Finally, the MCU closes many of its arcs by affirming that survival itself can be meaningful, that continuing to live, to care, and to remember in a damaged world is not a lesser form of heroism, but its most enduring expression, grounding the entire universe in the idea that being human is not a weakness to be overcome, but the reason any of it matters at all. One of the most human patterns in the MCU is that many heroes keep personal mementos rather than trophies, small objects tied to people they lost or moments they regret, suggesting that memory, not victory, is what they carry forward, and that remembrance becomes a private ritual rather than a public celebration. The MCU subtly conveys that choice is often more frightening than fate, because when destiny is removed, characters must accept responsibility for outcomes without the comfort of inevitability, making freedom itself a source of anxiety rather than relief. A quietly sad truth is that several heroes learn to lower their expectations for happiness, not because they stop wanting it, but because repeated loss teaches them to protect themselves from disappointment, turning emotional restraint into a survival strategy. The universe implies that doing the right thing rarely feels clean or complete, as morally correct decisions often leave characters dissatisfied and unsettled, reinforcing the idea that ethical action does not guarantee emotional peace. Another deeply human detail is that many MCU characters struggle with ordinary life more than with extraordinary danger, finding routine, stillness, and normal relationships harder to navigate than battles, because these moments offer no clear rules or victories. The MCU repeatedly suggests that identity is fluid rather than fixed, as characters redefine themselves after failure, loss, or change, showing that becoming someone new is not an act of reinvention, but a gradual, often reluctant process. A subtle but painful fact is that heroes are rarely given permission to be weak, either by society or by themselves, which forces vulnerability underground and transforms strength into an expectation rather than a choice. The films and series imply that reconciliation with the past is not always possible, and that sometimes the most honest resolution is learning to live alongside regret rather than attempting to erase it. One quietly hopeful truth is that the MCU often places acts of kindness in the background, small gestures between characters that go unnoticed, yet sustain emotional balance, suggesting that compassion operates quietly even when heroism is loud. Finally, the MCU consistently portrays endurance as an act of faith without certainty, where characters continue forward not because they believe everything will be fine, but because giving up would mean abandoning the people and values that still give their lives meaning. One of the most human realizations in the MCU is that many heroes are motivated less by hope than by a refusal to give up on people who remind them of who they used to be, turning protection into a way of preserving fragments of their own past rather than chasing an ideal future. The MCU subtly shows that exhaustion is a constant companion to heroism, not just physical fatigue but emotional weariness, as characters repeatedly face the same types of loss and conflict, suggesting that resilience is often maintained through routine rather than inspiration. A quietly painful truth is that several heroes internalize blame even when events are clearly beyond their control, carrying responsibility for outcomes no single individual could have prevented, which reflects a very human tendency to personalize failure as a way of maintaining the illusion of agency. The universe implies that courage often appears ordinary from the inside, as characters make difficult choices without feeling brave, confident, or heroic, revealing that valor in the MCU is frequently experienced as obligation rather than triumph. Another human detail is that many MCU characters struggle to articulate their pain, resorting instead to humor, deflection, or silence, which turns emotional distance into a coping mechanism and makes vulnerability feel riskier than combat. The MCU repeatedly suggests that belonging is temporary, as teams form under pressure and dissolve once the crisis passes, leaving individuals to renegotiate their identities in quieter, lonelier spaces where purpose is no longer externally defined. A subtle but relatable fact is that characters often continue relationships out of familiarity rather than fulfillment, holding on to what remains because starting over feels too uncertain, a reflection of how trauma can narrow the perceived range of possible futures. The films and series show that moral clarity erodes under prolonged stress as repeated exposure to crisis normalizes extreme decisions, making what once felt unthinkable gradually seem necessary, a process portrayed less as corruption and more as adaptation. One quietly sad aspect of the MCU is that moments of peace are often brief and interrupted, reinforcing the sense that calm is borrowed time rather than a stable state, which makes characters hesitant to fully invest in happiness even when it appears within reach. Finally, the MCU consistently frames humanity itself as the greatest vulnerability and the greatest strength, showing that emotions complicate decisions and create pain, yet also motivate sacrifice, connection, and perseverance, making the universe compelling not because its heroes are powerful, but because they remain unfinished, uncertain, and deeply human. One of the most human realizations in the MCU is that many heroes never stop feeling like they are reacting rather than choosing, as if every step forward is shaped by what has already been lost, which creates a quiet sense of inevitability where agency exists, but always within limits imposed by past trauma. The MCU subtly shows that closure is often partial or symbolic rather than complete, as characters find ways to continue without fully resolving their pain, suggesting that healing does not always mean understanding or acceptance, but learning how to live with unanswered questions. A quietly sobering fact is that the MCU treats responsibility as something that expands rather than fades, because once characters accept the consequences of their actions, they are rarely allowed to step back from them, turning accountability into a lifelong condition rather than a temporary burden. The universe implies that many heroes fear becoming obsolete, not because they crave relevance, but because irrelevance would force them to confront who they are without crisis, a question the MCU repeatedly frames as more frightening than any enemy. Another deeply human detail is that several characters continue to protect others even when they no longer believe they deserve peace themselves, turning altruism into a form of self-punishment as much as compassion. The MCU consistently suggests that emotional survival often requires selective honesty, as characters choose carefully what to reveal and what to keep private, balancing connection against self-preservation in a world where vulnerability can be exploited. A subtle but painful truth is that the MCU's heroes rarely receive reassurance in the moments they need it most, making doubt a persistent companion and reinforcing the idea that confidence is often constructed after the fact rather than felt in real time. The films and series imply that legacy is shaped as much by unintended consequences as by deliberate choices, meaning that characters influence the future in ways they cannot predict or control, binding them to outcomes that outlive their intentions. One quietly hopeful aspect of the MCU is that it allows characters to change slowly, showing growth through accumulated experience rather than sudden transformation, which mirrors real emotional development more closely than dramatic reinvention. Finally, the MCU presents humanity not as something heroes rise above, but as something they carry with them into every decision, making imperfection an enduring feature rather than a flaw to be overcome, and grounding its universe in the idea that saving the world does not require becoming less human, but enduring while remaining so. One of the most human truths in the MCU is that many heroes keep going not because they feel strong, but because stopping would force them to confront everything they have been avoiding, making action a form of emotional survival rather than confidence, and revealing that persistence is often fueled by fear of stillness rather than belief in victory. The MCU quietly shows that grief does not follow a heroic timeline, as characters continue to carry loss long after the world expects them to move on, suggesting that pain does not fade when the threat is over, but instead settles into daily life, shaping habits, silences, and small decisions in ways that rarely make headlines. A deeply human detail is that several heroes measure their worth by usefulness, equating being needed with being valued, which makes moments of irrelevance emotionally devastating and explains why stepping aside is often harder than facing danger, because it feels like disappearing rather than resting. The universe repeatedly implies that saving others does not automatically mean saving oneself, as many characters succeed outwardly while remaining internally fractured, reinforcing the idea that heroism can coexist with emotional damage rather than resolve it. One quietly painful fact is that the MCU's ordinary people often show more emotional realism than its heroes, reacting with fear, confusion, anger, or exhaustion instead of awe, reminding the audience that living in a world constantly on the brink of catastrophe would erode anyone's sense of safety over time. The MCU subtly frames companionship as the most fragile form of protection, because bonds are formed under pressure and tested by loss, making connection both essential and vulnerable, and explaining why characters hesitate to rely on others, even when isolation hurts more. Another human truth is that many MCU characters continue to act out of habit long after belief has faded, performing heroic roles almost automatically while internally questioning whether their actions still matter, which adds a quiet sadness to moments that might otherwise seem triumphant. The films and series suggest that emotional honesty is often postponed rather than denied, with characters promising themselves they will process their pain later, only to find that later rarely arrives, turning unspoken feelings into long-term burdens rather than temporary wounds. A subtle but relatable fact is that the MCU portrays healing as uneven and nonlinear, showing that characters can function, joke, and even succeed while still being deeply unwell, reflecting a reality where survival and recovery are not the same thing. Finally, the MCU consistently reminds us that behind every symbol, suit, or title is someone improvising their way through impossible circumstances, making choices with incomplete information and imperfect emotional tools, which is what ultimately grounds its universe, not in fantasy but in recognizably human fragility. One of the most quietly devastating facts of the MCU is that the blip creates a generation of people who lose 5 years of their lives without any narrative closure, returning to a world that has moved on emotionally, socially, and politically, which means that for millions of individuals, the universe does not feel saved but stolen, as relationships dissolve, careers vanish, and identities fracture, turning resurrection itself into a form of trauma that the films only briefly touch on but consistently frame as a lingering wound rather than a miracle. The MCU subtly establishes that Ultron is not merely a rogue artificial intelligence, but a distorted reflection of Tony Stark's deepest fear, because Ultron's obsession with peace through control mirrors Tony's own belief that safety can be engineered, making the destruction of Sokovia less a random catastrophe and more the physical manifestation of a mindset that prioritizes outcomes over human cost, a lesson Tony carries silently for the rest of his life. A tragic but often overlooked fact is that Peter Parker's sense of responsibility in the MCU is born less from heroism than from accumulated loss, because unlike many heroes who choose their path, Peter is repeatedly forced into it, by the deaths of mentors and the consequences of inaction, creating a version of Spider-Man whose optimism exists alongside a deep, unspoken exhaustion that grows heavier with each sacrifice he makes. The MCU repeatedly suggests that power does not heal trauma, but often intensifies it, particularly in characters like Wanda Maximoff, whose abilities expand alongside her grief, transforming loss into something volatile and dangerous, and implying that without emotional grounding, strength becomes a liability rather than a safeguard, a theme that runs quietly beneath many of the universe's most visually spectacular moments. One unsettling fact is that the MCU's victories frequently come at the cost of invisibility for ordinary suffering, because while battles are remembered through monuments and ceremonies, the everyday consequences are absorbed silently by civilians, reinforcing a world where heroism is celebrated publicly while recovery remains private, isolating those who cannot afford to move on. The MCU also establishes that moral certainty is rare and often temporary, as heroes are repeatedly placed in situations where every available option carries harm, making compromise inevitable and purity impossible, which reframes heroism not as moral perfection, but as the willingness to choose responsibility even when no outcome feels just. A subtle narrative truth is that many MCU heroes fear becoming irrelevant more than they fear death, because their identities are so deeply tied to being needed that peace itself becomes threatening, explaining why retirement is often portrayed as uneasy or incomplete, and why characters struggle to define themselves outside of conflict. The universe quietly reveals that technological progress in the MCU accelerates faster than ethical reflection, creating recurring cycles where innovation outpaces accountability, leading to repeated crises that are treated as exceptions rather than warnings, suggesting a world trapped in reactive heroism rather than preventative wisdom. Another tragic fact is that the MCU rarely allows its heroes to witness the full impact of the lives they save, which means their sacrifices often go unacknowledged on a personal level, reinforcing a loneliness where gratitude exists abstractly, but connection remains elusive, leaving heroes motivated by duty rather than affirmation. Finally, the MCU consistently portrays hope not as a destination, but as a process, something that must be actively rebuilt after every collapse, implying that even when the universe survives, meaning must be reconstructed piece by piece, choice by choice, in a cycle that never truly ends but continues as long as someone is willing to stand up again. One of the most revealing patterns in the MCU is that moments of silence often carry more narrative weight than action, because it is in stillness that characters confront the consequences they cannot fight, showing that reflection, regret, and hesitation are as integral to heroism as physical strength, even though these moments are frequently overshadowed by spectacle. The MCU subtly teaches that redemption is never guaranteed, as characters who seek forgiveness are not always granted it, reinforcing a universe where accountability matters and where past actions cannot always be balanced by future heroism, creating a moral landscape that resists simple absolution. A quietly unsettling fact is that villains in the MCU are often more self-aware than heroes expect, understanding their own moral compromises while still choosing to act, which complicates the idea of defeating evil, because awareness does not necessarily lead to restraint or remorse. The universe repeatedly implies that trust is the most fragile resource among heroes, because once broken, it reshapes relationships permanently, making reconciliation possible but never complete, and turning unity into something that must be continually renegotiated rather than assumed. Another overlooked truth is that many MCU characters experience identity fragmentation, struggling to reconcile who they were, who they are expected to be, and who they want to become, suggesting that superhuman abilities amplify internal conflict rather than resolve it. The MCU consistently frames leadership as isolating, portraying those who take responsibility as figures who must absorb doubt, blame, and loss without the luxury of shared certainty, reinforcing the idea that command often separates individuals from the very people they aim to protect. A subtle but recurring fact is that victories in the MCU are frequently temporary, functioning more as pauses between crises than definitive endings, which creates a narrative rhythm rooted in vigilance rather than resolution, and reinforces the sense that peace must be actively maintained. The films and series imply that memory itself is a burden, as characters who remember too much are often the most emotionally strained, suggesting that forgetting, though impossible for many, might sometimes be the kinder fate, even as remembrance remains essential to growth. Another quietly tragic aspect is that many heroes are denied the opportunity to grieve properly, forced to move forward quickly to meet new threats, which transforms grief into something internalized and unresolved, shaping decisions in ways that are rarely acknowledged openly. Finally, the MCU presents resilience not as an innate trait, but as a learned response to repeated failure, loss, and fear, implying that strength is built gradually through endurance rather than revealed instantly in moments of triumph, grounding its mythology in human perseverance rather than invincibility. One of the most understated truths of the MCU is that heroism often deepens divisions rather than resolving them, because even well intentioned actions create ripple effects that fracture alliances, as seen when differing ideas of responsibility, freedom, and control push heroes into opposition, suggesting that unity in this universe is fragile and conditional, maintained only as long as shared goals outweigh personal convictions. The MCU quietly implies that many heroes never fully recover from the moment they first choose violence, because crossing that line, even in defense of others, alters their relationship with the world permanently, making innocence something that can be remembered but never reclaimed, and turning every subsequent fight into a reminder of who they were forced to become. A recurring but rarely acknowledged fact is that the MCU treats collateral damage as an emotional burden rather than a statistical outcome, showing that heroes are aware of the lives disrupted by their actions even when they cannot address them directly, reinforcing a sense of moral weight that lingers long after the battle music fades. The universe repeatedly suggests that secrecy is both a shield and a curse, as hidden identities protect loved ones but isolate heroes from genuine connection, creating a paradox where intimacy becomes dangerous and honesty becomes a liability, leaving many characters emotionally guarded even in moments of apparent triumph. One quietly tragic aspect of the MCU is that many heroic sacrifices are made without certainty of success, meaning characters act not because they know they will win, but because inaction feels worse, reframing bravery as commitment in the absence of assurance rather than confidence in victory. The MCU also establishes that time does not heal evenly, because while societies move forward collectively, individuals process loss at different speeds, creating emotional dissonance where some characters are expected to function normally despite unresolved grief, emphasizing how recovery is often demanded rather than earned. A subtle but powerful fact is that the MCU rarely offers clear closure, allowing consequences to echo across multiple stories and phases, which creates a sense of continuity rooted not just in plot but in emotional memory, making the universe feel lived in rather than episodic. The films and series consistently suggest that being labeled a hero can be restrictive, as public perception freezes individuals into symbols that no longer reflect their inner reality, forcing characters to live up to ideals they did not choose and cannot fully embody. Another overlooked truth is that many MCU conflicts arise from failures of communication rather than irreconcilable ideology, implying that silence, secrecy, and assumption are often as dangerous as any weapon, and that many tragedies might have been avoided if trust had been easier to sustain. Finally, the MCU frames endurance as a form of courage equal to sacrifice, showing that continuing to exist, to care, and to engage with a damaged world after repeated loss requires a quieter but no less demanding strength, one that defines the universe as much as its battles do. One of the quietest but most consequential facts of the MCU is that the Battle of New York does not truly end in the Avengers because its aftermath becomes a permanent condition rather than a resolved event, shaping entire lives and storylines long after the portals close. As civilians are displaced, neighborhoods are rebuilt through corrupt contracts, and trauma becomes normalized in a world that celebrates the victory but rarely acknowledges the cost paid by those who were never asked to fight, turning New York into a city that survives rather than heals, which is why so many later MCU stories feel heavier in tone even when they are not explicitly about that invasion. A subtle but tragic truth of the MCU is that Steve Rogers spends the majority of his life fighting to protect a future he is never fully allowed to belong to, because even before he travels back in time at the end of Endgame, he is already displaced emotionally and culturally, surrounded by people who admire him as a symbol rather than understand him as a man, making his final choice to remain in the past less of a romantic ending and more of an admission that the present world, though saved, never truly made space for him. One of the most ironic facts about Tony Stark's journey is that the man who begins the MCU trying to control everything ultimately saves the universe by letting go completely, because the snap in Avengers Endgame is not just an act of sacrifice, but the first time Tony accepts that the outcome matters more than his survival, completing an arc that begins with fear-driven self-preservation and ends with a calm, almost resigned acceptance that some problems cannot be engineered away. The MCU quietly establishes that being saved by superheroes does not automatically improve people's lives, as seen in multiple narratives where ordinary citizens are left worse off after heroic interventions, losing homes, families, or stability, which creates a morally complex universe where heroism is real but imperfect, and where the presence of gods and geniuses does not eliminate injustice but instead exposes how unevenly protection is distributed across society. A surprisingly dark fact of the MCU is that many of its villains are not driven by madness or cruelty alone, but by an attempt to impose order on chaos they believe heroes have failed to resolve, making characters like Thanos, Killmonger, and even smaller scale antagonists function as distorted reflections of the same desire for meaning and control that motivates the heroes, blurring the line between savior and tyrant in ways the films rarely spell out but consistently imply. Despite its epic scale, the MCU repeatedly shows that personal trauma often matters more than world-ending threats, because characters are frequently defined not by the battles they win, but by the losses they cannot undo, such as Wanda Maximoff's grief, Peter Parker's guilt, or Natasha Romanoff's unresolved past, suggesting that emotional consequences in this universe linger longer than physical destruction and cannot be reversed by time travel or advanced technology. One quietly unsettling fact is that the MCU's governments are almost always reactive rather than proactive, stepping in only after catastrophes occur, which creates an environment where accountability is inconsistent and power is often exercised too late, reinforcing the idea that superheroes fill a vacuum left by institutional failure, rather than acting as part of a coherent system, a pattern that explains both public dependence on heroes and the fear that leads to initiatives like the Sokovia Accords. The MCU subtly implies that heroism is isolating by nature, as most heroes, regardless of popularity or power, experience profound loneliness, whether it is Thor losing everyone connected to his past, Bruce Banner being unable to live a normal life, or street-level heroes operating in secrecy, reinforcing the idea that saving others often requires giving up the possibility of being fully understood or emotionally safe oneself. A lesser discussed but significant fact is that the MCU treats survival as morally complicated, rather than inherently virtuous, because characters who survive catastrophic events are often burdened by guilt and responsibility rather than relief, particularly after the blip, where those who remain alive must confront a broken world without the comfort of closure, turning survival into a form of endurance rather than triumph. Finally, one of the most defining facts of the MCU is that it consistently frames hope as something fragile rather than guaranteed, emerging not from certainty or power, but from repeated, often painful choices to keep going despite loss, failure, and fear, which is why the universe resonates beyond spectacle, functioning less as a collection of superhero stories and more as a long meditation on resilience in a world where being saved does not mean being whole.